Okay, next victim is Julian or Julian. I'm not sure which it is. So, aperture looks great. I see you used an iPhone, and so I'm guessing that you changed the aperture after the fact. So it's an iPhone 10. So you can't, I think you can't actually change the aperture at the time. Correct me if I'm wrong. But at any rate, you can certainly see a huge difference in the depth of field between f1.8 and whatever this other one is. F22 is what you have labeled it as. Okay, yeah, great on those. And let's look at distance. Okay, great. It's a little hard to tell the depth of field from further back, in part because it's just further back. But also because whatever's behind the rose bush is pretty close, so there isn't a whole lot of space going back. Nevertheless, we can certainly see the shallower depth of field here in the closer image, the fact that the background falls off pretty quickly. Okay, and focal length of lens. What a lovely setting. Looks really beautiful. Now, one thing I have to point out here is that it says that the date is 8/24/2018. So do get back to me on that, because everything, all the work submitted for this class needs to have been made for this class. And so not before April 5th of 2021. But let's take a look at these. So 55 millimeter lens, and then 250 millimeter lens. I'm not quite sure how that worked there. And how the date for the first one is 2018 and the second is 2021. I'm guessing that you know, came in after the fact, but do get back to me on that. It's a lovely image. The extremely shallow depth of field works beautifully with it so shallow that the foreground falls out as well. It's a lovely effect. Okay, so get back to me on these things, and nice job. All right. Okay, Christian Soriano. Images look lovely. I would ask you to check the assignment on how to submit the images. Please put the images in separate folders and entitle the images so I know which are which. Okay. So let's look at this set first, and it looks as if you have changed the distance from subject in this set, and they look great. So you've kept the aperture and the focal length of the lens the same. Very nice. And at f5, the depth of field is relatively shallow. You can see there's a gradual fall off. A nice isolation of the flower in this image. In the second set, let's see here, great vantage point. I love these images. They work beautifully as images. So these are for aperture, and let's see, you had the camera and aperture priority. So you went from f3.5 to f8. Is f8 the smallest aperture that your camera has, that your lens is capable of. Just curious. Okay. It's very difficult. Actually, we cannot see depth of field in these images because the background is at infinity and there's nothing between the trees and the sky to show us that there's a change, if there is a change in the depth of field. So clouds, a cloudy sky, billowy clouds, would allow us to see change in the depth of field. But because there's nothing there, we can't see that depth. Okay. And here we have the aperture at f5 and the focal length at 8.18 millimeters, and then coming in closer with the lens, the focal length at essentially 25 millimeters. And the equivalent, so that's on a small camera, the equivalent on a 35 millimeter full frame sensor camera is 146 millimeters. So definitely a longer telephoto lens. And back here with the 18.18 millimeter focal length, the 35 millimeter equivalent is 48 millimeters, so very much in the normal range. Okay, and at f5, we can certainly see a change in the depth of field, mostly in the foreground. So in the wide angle or the normal image, everything in the foreground is in focus, and as we go back, it's still in focus, right? Because of the wide angle lens. But this piece of wood shows in the second image, it becomes the foreground, and it is out of focus, as well as the rear of the image. So that definitely tells us that the depth of field has changed. Okay, so very nice job overall, Christian. Again, the aperture images don't show a change in the depth of field because the background is at infinity with nothing in between. But all of the images work beautifully. Okay, great job. Thank you. Okay, Helene Steppens, I think. Okay, nice job overall, Helene. Very nicely done. I would like you to have used, to have shot in different situations, one for each element affecting depth of field. That said, you did a very nice job. You've done a very nice job. So shallow depth of field here at F4. Your title says 5.6, but the metadata says F4. Okay, so F4 and F22, and there's a huge difference in the depth of field. It looks as if you were relatively close in terms of maybe not physical distance, but the focal length of the lens, and that of course will affect the depth of field. So even with F22, pretty small aperture, the background all the way back here is still out of focus, and that's just how it is with a longer lens. Okay, let's look at your distance images. Okay, so at f4.5, and this is at 6 feet and 1 foot, and there's certainly a difference in the depth of field, but again, in this case, because the aperture is large, even though you're further away at 6 feet, the depth of field is still actually shallow. It's shallower when you come in to a distance of 1 foot. Okay, good. And the focal length of the lens, in this case 24 millimeters, and then 50. It's not a huge difference in the focal length of the lens. So you might use the extremes, back up a little bit more, and shoot the second one with the longer, with the longer lens. Not that you don't see a difference here, you certainly do. Again, at f4.5, the depth of field is actually still shallow, but much shallower with the longer lens. Okay, good job, Helene. Nice job overall. Thank you. Okay, next up, Hamdan Syed. Here are your, your distance images. Good job in changing the, the distance and the framing. It's a little difficult to see the change in the depth of field because there's actually no depth or not enough to really see a change in how much is in focus. So we see the flowers and the foliage, but not, nothing behind or in front. And there isn't in that particular part of the frame. So perhaps if you came in up here, let's see. So if you selected an area where you could see the background as well as the foreground, then we can see a change in the depth of field more easily. Okay, great. Now let's get back to the library module and to the aperture f-stop. So you changed from f2.8 to f22. Great. But as you can see, one image is much brighter than the other. So you had the camera in the manual mode. And when you have the camera in the manual mode, you need to check the light meter, because although the light meter will tell you if you're exposing correctly or not, but it won't actually make the change for you. So, of course, when you change the aperture from f2.8 to f22, you're stopping down by a number of stops and letting less and less light in. And so you need to compensate for that change by changing the shutter speed as well. So you would need to change, go from a 60th of a second to, maybe something more like a quarter of a second. I have to count the the f-stops to check that. So as you change the shutter speed, the light meter reading will change. You could also, and this will be easier for you, put the camera into the aperture priority mode, and then when you change the aperture, the camera will automatically change the shutter speed for you. It figures out the equivalent exposures. So that said, it's a little difficult to see the depth of field in this first image because it's so bright. Yeah, I just can't really see back into the frame enough. I certainly can here, and I can tell that the depth of field is quite great. So difficult lighting situation because you have a bright background and a dark foreground. The camera, the light meter, has to choose where to expose for. Okay, and focal length of lens. Interesting images. I like your vantage point, getting down on the level of the table. F6.3 is a little bit large to show great depth of field. So if we look at this image, the foreground is out of focus. So if you or had you used a smaller aperture, let's say f16, more of the foreground would have been in focus. And then with the, the longer lens, 67 millimeters, the depth of field is shallower still. So we see a fall off here in the flowers, and it's really very beautiful. I like the reflections very much, and actually the overexposure of the background works very nicely in this case. Yeah. So again, this image actually is showing shallow depth of field. The distance between the flowers, or the space between the flowers and the wall further back in the frame, shows greater depth of field there. But because you included the foreground, it shows that it's out of focus. Okay, nice job, Hamdan. Thank you. Nicole Takulog. Nice job, very nice job on all of these. So we'll look at your aperture first. f5 at 1/320th of a second, and f22 at 1/25th of a second, and quite a difference in the depth of field. Both images work beautifully. The shallow depth of field image, of course, isolates the flower from the background more. So they're just different images. The greater depth of field image shows the setting, the context of the flower. Okay, beautiful. And distance from subject. This one obviously closer at f8, and the background falling out of focus. A nice subtle kind of gradient of focus, and great depth of field here back at about 6 feet. It says here from the flowers. Okay, good. And focal length of the lens, so 18 millimeters here. Looking at this bottle brush, I like your vantage point looking up. It's almost as if it's raining bottle brush. Very, very beautiful. Here at 55 millimeters, definitely shallower depth of field, even at f5.6. It's a little harder to see because, of course, the background is dark, but with these points of light, that's how we can definitely tell the depth of field is shallow. Is shallower because we're getting these little circles. That's called bokeh. Some people get almost obsessive about bokeh, the appearance of the shallow depth of field. And some, different lenses give different appearances. I think this is very beautiful. So great job on all of these. Very nicely done. Thank you. Okay, how Tran. So look at your aperture images first, and very nicely done in terms of the, showing the change in depth of field. So f4 and f22, a most definite difference. Okay, good. And let's look at your distance. And it looks as if for both distance and focal length, your sets of images, you changed the focal length as well in both. So this one at 24 millimeters and then 60 millimeters, and quite different images by coming in closer. The depth of field is actually shallow in both, mostly because of the size of the aperture. So f4, a large aperture, gives you shallow depth of field, even sorry, let's go to this other one. Yeah, sorry. Even when you're further back and with a wider angle lens, of course it's shallower still, coming in closer. And then the images labeled for focal length of the lens, there isn't that much space going back in the frame between the walkie-talkie, the Bengay, and the wall. So tell me how you chose these elements and what they represent, okay? But you've changed, so from 24 millimeters here to 65 millimeters in this case. And it looks as if also the point of focus changed. So in the 24 millimeter image, you focused on the walkie-talkie, and in the 65 millimeter image, you focused on the lens cover. So I want you to keep the point of focus the same, so we can just see how much space in the frame changes with the changing either focal length of lens or distance from subject or aperture. So if you want to resubmit images, that's fine, that's great. But again, both the distance from subject and the focal length sets of images have changed the focal length of the lens. Okay. All right. Thank you.